Recorded live from Hong Kong and Toronto. This is the PR and Law Podcast.
The PR and Law Podcast.
Turn it up. With your hosts, Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie.
Welcome to episode 10 of the PR and Law Podcast. I'm your host, Cam McMurchie, along with Ewan Christie.
Hello, Cameron.
All right, I'm a PR guy based in Hong Kong and publisher of the Digital Bits PR and Communications newsletter. You can find that at digitalbitspr.com. Ewan is an employment lawyer and partner at Duntroon LLP in Toronto, Canada, and you can find his firm online at duntroonllp.law. If you enjoy the podcast, we mention this all the time, please share it with a friend. It means a lot to us. It's one of the only ways we have to get word out about the show. And you can follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. So we are on social media everywhere. And the account name is PR Law Podcast. So that's facebook.com/PR Law Podcast, twitter.com/PR Law Podcast, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you can support us on Patreon as well. That would mean a lot. You can find that on our website, prlawpodcast.com, and you can click support the show. And lastly, we are on YouTube. So if you prefer to listen that way, you can check us out there. And we're also always happy to take questions on the show. Ewan and I will do our best to try and answer those. And you can just tag us on social media with the hashtag PRLawPod. We have all kinds of stuff to talk about today. And we have our first guest coming up on the show in a bit. But Ewan, what's happening with you?
Well, it's another gorgeous summer day here in Toronto, Cameron. Big news for us big news for me and any other parent in the province of Ontario, I suppose. Childcare centers reopened officially on Friday. Now, I say that with
relieved.
Well, I say that with sort of a gargantuan asterisk attached because the government effectively came out 3 days prior and said, oh, by the way, childcare centers, as of Friday, you can all reopen. But as far as I can tell, at least from the director of our childcare center, nobody was really provided any sort of notice or any consultation from what I understand. So none of the childcare centers are really in any sort of position to open. So as to when my 3-year-old will have an opportunity to go back and see some other children, and my wife and I will have a chance to finally get back into our offices, I don't know, but exciting news nonetheless. What's going on your end?
So you're still getting cases in Toronto, right? I haven't seen any numbers, but I heard recently that Toronto is still kind of a hotspot. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, they've sort of moved on to a stage 2 in the rest of the province, which is, consistent with more and more things opening up. Toronto has been one of the excluded areas that remains in sort of stage 1. We're still, relatively speaking, on lockdown. The government also announced this week that they've introduced the bubbling, the social bubbling, so we can now have up to 10 people within our particular bubble. So, we had a friend come over on the weekend, and I was able to give her a hug and have her in our home. And that was the first person that has stepped inside our home that I've had any physical contact with I don't know. I mean, I guess going all the way back to the beginning of March.
Well, I hope you've hugged your daughter and your wife, and there was some physical contact in your life.
Well, yes, I'm talking about anybody outside of my home. So, but it was a really exciting moment. This is sort of a close friend of mine, of my wife's, of our daughters, and it was a big moment getting to have someone physically step into your home for the first time in months, and have a hug. It was a big deal,
All right. Exciting times. Let's have a quick check of the COVID numbers here. Looking sort of around the world and after Ewan's update there in Toronto. So worldwide, we're up to 7.78 million cases and 430,000 deaths, which is really remarkable. I think it looks like we may hit that 500,000 deaths number, which would be A very sad milestone. In the U.S., they're up to 2 million cases overall. They've had 115,000 deaths there. In Hong Kong, we've hit 1,110 cases. So, I mean, we've had another good week. On June 9th, 10th, 11th, and 14th last week, 0 new cases on all of those days. We had 1 case on the 12th and 1 on the 13th. So we have not had many cases overall, and it's been quite good. The good news out of all of that is that the social distancing rules that we did have in place here, or we still have in place, no one's really referred to it as a bubble here like you did, Ewan, but it was 8 people, a gathering of 8 people. Any more than that was not allowed. So that may be extended later on this month. And then Ocean Park, which is one of the really big theme parks in Hong Kong, it opened up this weekend. The book fair, which is always a huge event, it's the largest in Asia every year. It will happen in next month. So this is all good news, even though it's not going to be quite the same. So Ocean Park is only the maximum number of people is about 25% of overall capacity, and then the book fair obviously is not going to be as big as last year either. But one of the things that we wanted to talk about today, and we have a guest on the show for the first time, is there was some big news that was in Hong Kong, but also globally, because it does affect airlines globally. And that was a Hong Kong government bailout of Cathay Pacific Airways. So I had an alert to my phone when I woke up saying that Cathay was suspending trading of its shares. So we knew a big announcement was coming, and then it became clear that the government was going to pour $3.5 billion US into the airline and take a 6.08% stake. So to talk about that, we welcome to this show Danny Lee, who is one of the senior reporters at the South China Morning Post, the leading global newspaper that covers Hong Kong and China. Danny, welcome to the show.
Hi, folks. Good to hear from you.
Yeah, great. We actually worked with Danny years ago, so it's great to reconnect with him. What happened, Danny, with this Cathay Pacific bailout? Can you kind of walk us through how this came about?
Yeah, Cathay Pacific, it has been struggling under the weight of COVID. It has 240 odd planes, and most of its passenger planes, so a good number of them, about 200 of them, have essentially been grounded for 3 to 4 months now. They have been suffering through the collapse in passenger numbers because nobody wants to fly. Their daily passenger numbers collapsed by 99%. And in that effect, when you're making no money essentially on air tickets, then your key source of revenue dries up. So for a couple of months now, it has been struggling, carrying on by running cargo flights, but essentially it has not been making money over a 2 to 3 month period, and it still has to pay staff. It still has to run its operations. Now, Cathay is such a big influence on Hong Kong. It's been around for 70 years, so it's a fairly well-established company through the many years and decades, and it's very synonymous with Hong Kong. It's grown hand in hand with Hong Kong. But this crisis of COVID has essentially almost brought it to its knees. So on Monday, there was some developments that we had heard of, and by Tuesday, when we expected the shares to be suspended, we knew things were happening. And as we were able to confirm, Cathay received a fairly unexpected rescue package from the government. Now, it's almost unheard of for the government to rescue a private company, but given the seriousness of the situation, Cathay went to the government for help a couple of months ago, and they agreed a package of, in total, 3.5 billion. Cathay will get 5 billion in terms of restructuring, $5 billion US in terms of to restructure its finances, and that will see it through the crisis of COVID. Hopefully, it seems to be enough, more than enough money. Cathay Pacific's chairman Patrick Healy said on Tuesday that last week that it was very close to collapse. It had no other options except for this refinancing package, most of it put forward by the government of Hong Kong. So, yeah, it's a fairly unexpected, in many senses, a surprise, but the only option, given most governments are doing this, bailing out airlines. And Cathay is probably quite late to the party on this. In terms of trying to look at its options, it's how much money it's got left, how much money it's going to burn through over the next couple of months. It's quite late to the party in terms of raising significant amounts of money compared to other airlines around the world.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned in there that it's rare for the Hong Kong government to sort of step in and take an ownership stake in a company like this. And that's what really caught my eye as well. Because it isn't something, I mean, the Hong Kong government is really hands off, as everyone knows. And so, like, why this time? Why Cathay? Why was it so important? And what would have happened if we lost Cathay Pacific?
Well, if we lost Cathay, it would mean in normal times it's responsible for half of the passengers coming in and out of Hong Kong. It carries 2/5 of all the cargo that comes through Hong Kong. So Hong Kong, in very many senses, is so reliant on Cathay to keep its planes up in the air. It's so important to the movement of people, to the movement of trade flows. So in terms of the ecosystem within aviation, and then you look at another aspect in terms of the economy and the city's development as a whole, Cathay is pretty much at the center of that. It underpins the aviation sector and it plays a huge role in the economy. So without Cathay, there'd be very few options for the economy to tick over, particularly during this crisis, with cargo planes still flying that Cathay operates. Essentially, there'll be almost no passenger flights out of Hong Kong. There are still a few, but Cathay is still responsible for the most of them, the ones that are still operating at the moment. So within the grand scheme of things, Cathay is pretty much at the center of things, and the government felt that it could not let Cathay collapse. It needed to provide something in order for Cathay to keep on running, not just for the next couple of months, but during this COVID crisis, which we still don't know how much longer this crisis will go on for. We are starting to see signs of a recovery in Asia, but again, around the world, Europe and in North America, we still see many, many issues. And without borders being open, very few people will be able to fly, very few planes will be able to come and go, because essentially it's very difficult for people to move without the risk of getting quarantined or catching COVID.
Right, right. And it's sort of a double whammy too, because I mean, Cathay was hit really hard last year because of the protests in Hong Kong. And of course that resulted in the chairman of Swire and also the CEO of Cathay kind of pushed aside as a result of those protests. So, I mean, I know Cathay's had a really tough time. And I guess, I mean, I don't know if you know this, Danny, so I don't want to put you on the spot, but like I've always said to people, Hong Kong is like a country in a sense, because if you're going somewhere else, you have to cross a border. There's no way to go to another city or another province or country, or another province rather, without crossing this international boundary. So it makes, flights necessary and going through these borders necessary basically for everything. And my sense is that the air travel market is picking up somewhat in mainland China. And I guess that would be one reason for that. But can you talk to that a little bit, and just like the state of airlines globally? Because I know the bailout of Cathay, that's one airline here, but it's certainly not the only airline, as you mentioned. This is happening in a lot of places because airlines are facing really, really tough times.
Right, Cathay was one of the last, one of the latest ones to be bailed out. I mean, we've seen dozens and dozens of airlines be rescued, big and small. So Cathay is not the exception to this. And I think one of the figures that has come out more recently, according to the industry, that 123 billion has been poured into airlines to help rescue them, whether it be through direct bailouts or through elements of cost savings. So at the moment, we are seeing the industry pretty much on its knees, but where Asia was first and worst hit by the crisis initially, it is now starting to see small pockets of demand, particularly in domestic flying, where in China, that's a big market. I mean, China is supposed to be going from the second to the world's biggest air travel market before COVID hit. The domestic market is enormous and enormously profitable for mainland Chinese airlines. And that element where there are no borders or boundaries per se, that is where a lot more flight activity is going on at the moment. We are seeing some green shoots in other parts of Asia, where Asia has generally been able to contain the virus and keep things under control. You mentioned earlier on in your show, you talked about how Hong Kong's had a pretty good week again. Many parts of Asia have seen a good week. New Zealand have, in fact, got no more active cases of COVID. So I think they're one of the first in the world. I think Macau also has almost zero, close to zero cases, active cases. So we do see in Asia there is a momentum, but there is still fear of COVID cases re-emerging and outbreaks, particularly in the Chinese capital, Beijing. We see a quite serious second outbreak in stemming from a food market, which the authorities are responding to. However, it's not really having an impact, say, in aviation at the moment, because the authorities are responding to it. But still in Asia, there is some hope that air travel demand will come back a little bit quicker, particularly in the domestic market, but hopefully with the formation of travel bubbles or air bridges, if you were, where countries will agree with other countries that it is safe for their people to come to and from without needing quarantine or limited quarantine, more testing in order to allow people to come to and fro. So there is some hope that more elements of air travel will pick up through the rest of this year and into early next year, where other parts may not do so.
Yeah, fingers crossed. I mean, we're seeing how quickly, things can change. There can be low numbers of cases or no cases for a long time, and then suddenly there's a cluster or an outbreak somewhere. So it can change quickly. Ewan, do you want to hop in on this at all with regard to aviation? Go ahead.
Yeah, Danny, I had a good question for you. I mean, one of the issues that's been kind of at the forefront around the airlines in North America has been individual airline policies with regard to ticket refunds. There's been a lot of controversy around this because, of course, passengers who had purchased tickets that for flights that inevitably were canceled as a result of COVID, on a policy by policy basis, some airlines have been very, very reluctant to provide full refunds. And that's certainly resulted in a lot and will continue to result in a lot of litigation here in North America. I was just curious, generally speaking in Asia, what's the policy been with airlines in terms of refunding ticket prices? Have they been reluctant to do that?
The airlines in Asia have been doing their part to give refunds back. They've clearly been very slow, like most airlines, the huge volume of people trying to get their money back. But at the same time, airlines have a balancing act of trying to make sure they manage their cash flow. The huge number of refunds they've had to deal with in terms of cash volume, if they gave it all out in one go, I think airlines would stop operating. They would go bankrupt, frankly, because airlines have taken a significant amount of money in advance for what they assumed would go towards their flying program through 2020, and until COVID hit, all things looked very well. So the airlines have done all right, but again, the airlines are feeling the strain, and you see one or two airlines. I'm not going to name names here because they'll probably try and get me involved in litigation. They have tried to slow things down and offered things such as vouchers. Vouchers emerged fairly early on and has been embraced because airlines get to keep the money. They get to encourage people to fly again in future, and they hope that by not having to give the refund, it just will help their cash position a little bit more. And we do see some airlines trying to encourage people to take vouchers instead of refunds, but giving them the incentive of using a voucher which has 10 to 20% more value than the ticket price they originally paid for, in order for them to be incentivized to not take a refund. So there is better behavior, I would say, in Asia overall, because I think they're much more conscious about their brand and brand positioning, and then governments being more involved with the airlines here in the region. So unlike in Europe and the US in particular, where there have been a lot of heat from customers threatening to sue using other methods to get their money back, I think in Asia the situation is much better.
I guess I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, Danny, because this isn't really necessarily an aviation specific question. And Cam, I guess you could probably jump in on this too. Do you see the decision of the Hong Kong government getting involved and providing a bailout as precedent setting in any way? Do you think that there will be other industries that will now come forward and say, well, hey, you stepped in and you helped Cathay Pacific. Can you step in and help us as well?
I think from the government's point of view, they think there is not another company with such significance who faces such trouble who would come forward and say, hey, Hong Kong government, I need help. With the other measures that the Hong Kong government have put in place to keep the economy going, to save companies more broad-based, they would hope that the measures are enough. Companies, again, have to do their bit to ensure that they are well managed through the crisis. But for a company like Cathay, it was a special one-off case in the government's view, given its importance and given how much it affects the economy. So I don't necessarily think it's a precedent, but there is clearly some eyebrows that are being raised where you look at seeing, oh, the government has done this. What does this mean in future? Could it intervene in other companies in such a way? I don't think that will be the case from the government's point of view. Again, it has set, let's say, a model of what could happen in future if other companies get into trouble.
Okay, Danny, thank you so much for joining us. It was really great to have you on the show and talk about this, because it was big news locally and it was also in the news around the world this week. And we hope to have you on again the next time something like this pops up. And I know you actually cover a lot of different things, so we could have you on for all sorts of stuff. So thanks, Danny, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danny.
All right, that's Danny Lee from the South China Morning Post, their renowned aviation editor. And we did work with Danny years ago, Ewan and I, when we had a website called the Nanfeng. I think some of our listeners, at least on this side of the world, may be familiar or have heard of it. But Danny was one of our key reporters there. I remember Ewan; he was very active covering the typhoons, if I recall.
Yes, that's right.
Tracking the typhoon all night long as it ripped apart Shenzhen and Guangzhou and other places like that in southern China. All right. So Ewan, I want to get into a couple of other things here, because we do have a lot to talk about today. And one of them, just quickly, Danny mentioned it during his quick visit with us, which is the outbreak of the coronavirus at the wet market in Beijing. This is another interesting case. There were a number of infections from here, and the market has been shut down. Parts of Beijing have been kind of blocked off, and schools that were set to open are now closed again. And I think this is such a good example of basically, how the virus can come back very quickly, right when we think we've gotten a really good handle on it. So I think this sort of thing could happen in other parts of the world as well. And then the other item is sort of what's going on with the U.S. and there is a lot happening with the protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. So I want to get a quick update from a U.S. radio station. This is KFI AM 640 in Minneapolis.
Protesters have taken to the streets for a third straight weekend in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, over the death of George Floyd in police custody.
If boys don't get it, if boys don't get it, if boys don't get it.
The Minneapolis City Council has unanimously passed a resolution to begin dismantling the police department and transforming the public safety system.
So you can see there's still protests happening, going into, I believe, their third week now. Ewan, how does it look from your vantage point there in North America?
Well, I mean, the protests have certainly spread here now as well. We've had large scale protests across the country, a number here in Toronto. Probably one of the most prominent protests was one that involved the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister took a knee during one of the Black Lives Matters protests, and obviously that got a great deal of press, both for and against. And something I wanted to talk about, I was thinking later in the show towards the end, a great article I read by Marie Hennen, who is a prominent, if not the most prominent, criminal lawyer in Canada, who wrote a rather scathing op-ed in the Globe and Mail about this and about our prime minister taking a knee and saying how, hey, that's a great start, but you're the prime minister and you're in a position to be able to do a lot more than just take a knee. And she commented extensively on a number of the companies and politicians that have effectively been paying lip service to the cause, coming out with prominent statements and tweets saying, we support the movement, but then not really doing anything above and beyond that. And there's been a lot of talk politically in terms of, well, what should the government do? And there's been discussion around defund the police here in Canada as well. And one of the things that Marie Hennen addressed in her article is that the government is speaking as if we don't know what we can do here, or there hasn't been discussion around these issues. And she talked about two prominent commissions in Canada dealing specifically with this issue and providing a whole series of legislative recourse that can be introduced at the federal level to address these issues, but no one has done anything. One of the prominent issues she talks about is the mandatory minimum sentencing in Canada, something that Trudeau's Liberal government campaigned to remove. It was introduced by the previous Harper Conservatives, and it's still on the books. Stuff like this, and she also commented, and I thought this was interesting as well. She talked about some of the pushback against the Black Lives Matter movement, where some of the critics have said, well, look, the reality is if we look at the statistics, there are still more whites being killed by police than blacks. And, Marie Hennen talks about this in terms of how it's just completely the wrong approach. She's saying, and her argument is it's a distortion of the actual statistics, and that there's a whole slew of studies and statistical evidence to demonstrate that both in Canada and the US, there's a disproportionate percentage of blacks and Indigenous, and that's another issue that's arisen in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests here, is the Indigenous communities once again starting to rally and say, well, hey, look, we've been talking about this for years. When are things going to change? But blacks and Indigenous have disproportionately been subjected to violence. So it's not just about killings, and it's not really an answer to say, well, more white people are killed, or there's more white on white violence, quote unquote, compared to black on black violence. What they don't say, and this is Marie Hennen's argument, is that the real issue that needs to be discussed is that if you're black, or if you're an Indigenous man in particular, you're more likely than a white man to be harassed by the police, to be stopped and searched by the police, to be arrested, to be held for bail and incarcerated. And that these are the statistics that matter, that if you're black or if you're Indigenous, you can't drive, you can't walk without living in fear of some state harassment or interference. And, the other point that she makes, that's a perfectly valid one, is that the majority of interactions with police, they don't result in criminal charges or arrests. So, in other words, they're never reported. There's never any documented evidence as to what occurred. So any individual who's pulled over and happens to be harassed by the police or, illegally searched, if there are no charges that follow from that interaction or that altercation, very rarely is there any documented evidence that's brought to the police force in terms of what happened. And these are the real issues that have been completely neglected by a lot of the criticism that's been pushing back about white on white violence versus black on black violence. Anyway, so I'll put a note in the show notes to Hennen's article, but it's a really, really compelling read, and it comes from someone who is expertly qualified to be speaking on the issue, given what she does for a living.
Okay, that is a perfect segue, Ewan, because this goes nicely into what I wanted to talk about. So let's do that.
Continue the debate with us on social media. Join us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at PR Law Podcast. All one word, PRLAW Podcast. Send us your questions now by email to askus@prlawpodcast.com. That's all one word, askus@prlawpodcast.com. Or on social media with the hashtag PRLawPod. That's hashtag PRLAWPOD.
Okay, to go a little bit along with what you said, Ewan, there's a huge corporate PR angle to what's happening right now with Black Lives Matter. And we talked about this on a previous show, basically about some of the things like Nike and Adidas were doing to signal their support. So, I mean, that is still progressing, but it's going a lot deeper than it used to go, because it's turning out that slogans are not enough, that people want people who are in positions of power, as you were suggesting, with Prime Minister Trudeau, to actually do something about it. So the first key thing I wanted to mention, and you may have seen this study, but the support of Black Lives Matter has shot up in terms of public opinion and support for the movement. So it moved as much as it has in the last 2 years in a matter of days. I believe it's gone up 17 points in just a couple of weeks in terms of support for the movement in the US, which is a very, very big change, because you can think back to Colin Kaepernick, taking a knee in the NFL was 4 years ago now, because he's been out of the NFL for 3 years. And there was some division about that. Not everybody supported his protest. And when you take a look at it today, things have changed so quickly that even Roger Goodell, the NFL commissioner, has come out and said that the NFL supports Black Lives Matter, and even a bit of a mea culpa on its original position with Colin Kaepernick. But there's a lot of companies that are starting to step forward, because there is a lot of pressure on them. So I do think a lot of this comes from genuine support of Black Lives Matter, but I also think some of it is brands are coming under real pressure. So, I mean, a couple of examples. Jack Dorsey, who's the chief executive of Twitter and Square, has decided to make Juneteenth, the Juneteenth holiday in the US, which is the year that slavery was abolished and slaves were emancipated, is held on June 19th every year. So, I mean, he's declared that is now a holiday at the company, and staff will not be required to come into work on that day. Walmart as well has decided to stop locking up what they call multicultural hair and beauty products in display cases. That's another example. And I think it's interesting to see where this pressure is going to go, because if you take a look at companies that just make basic statements of support, or even people that have come out, in support of the movement on Twitter or Facebook, unless it's to some level of depth, there's some criticism, almost like these statements of support are being looked at under a microscope to make sure that they mean what they're saying in this pledge of support, and that there will be some action to go along with it. And this is very different, to past cases or past incidents of racism or death at the hands of a police officer, such as Ferguson, and in incidents before that. So it is interesting to see how this is going to go for companies. And it's also it's a delicate time for them, because it's easy to make a misstep. Yeah.
I mean, it really, it's the lip service comments that are really frustrating, and somewhat infuriating to read. The ones that look like and read like a cash grab for a business, which really is just not the point, and it's not the approach. And I understand that there are those businesses that are rushing to be supportive, and want to do their part. And I think that on some level is admirable, provided that their heart is in the right place. But again, you read some of these statements and they're hollow, and they're empty, and they don't speak to the real substantive change that needs to occur. So, that's great that you're going to issue a statement, but what is your company going to do? How are you going to alter your practices? How are you going to alter your employment practices? What sort of standards, what sort of policies are going to be revised? Are you going to introduce policies? There's a lot of companies still, and I certainly speak with clients on this issue all the time, that don't have anti-harassment, anti-discrimination policies at their workplace. And I think when you don't have that, you're really sending the wrong message to your employees, whether or not it's something you just haven't turned your mind to. The reality is that in the absence of something like that, it suggests that you don't take these issues seriously. So, these are little things that companies can do that can hold some real sway. It also is a good way to protect employers because it means that if these issues arise, you have a clear policy framework in terms of how you're going to address these sorts of systemic discriminatory issues that continue to occur in Canada and North America and across the world. And I think that's why we've seen these protests spread to the extent that they have.
Yeah, and this demand for real change. I mean, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, put out a statement talking about how this is something that Apple is going to try and address. And when you look at their leadership webpage, everyone is white. Most are men, with the exception of one female who is Chinese, who is managing director of Greater China. Everyone else on that executive team is white. And I mean, this isn't, I'm not sitting here trying to really shine a negative light on these companies, but I think they're going to have to do a lot more than just signal support. And something like this is really, I mean, especially a company like Apple, which does try and, tout its sort of CSR initiatives in its community, and it's open and it participates in pride parades. It's very active in social causes, but it's got to reflect that in the company. And this has been a problem with tech in general, but especially at the leadership level. It's the same issue, in the NFL. I heard the other day that, black players have been playing in the NFL for decades now. So why is it that there are just, I think there's 3 executives that are black and 1 head coach? Don't hold me to those numbers, but it's very, very, very small considering how many black players have played. And so these are issues, and addressing them is going to be difficult, but it's something that's, I think people are really ready to look at and say, okay, it's time we do it.
Yeah, well, and also to recognize that this isn't something that's going to be fixed with a magic bullet overnight, right? That a company comes forward and says, okay, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. I mean, this change, when you want to affect real substantive change and address systemic issues, these are not the sorts of things that can be fixed with a Band-Aid, with one sort of single policy initiative by a company or by a business. These are changes and reforms that are going to have to occur over months and over years. So look, I think it's great that we're hopefully heading down that path. And what I'm hopeful for is that we'll still be talking about these issues in 6 months and a year and 2 years, and that companies will still be looking at these issues in 6 months and a year and 2 years. Because you're right, you can't just completely transform, your executive or your board overnight. You have to sit down and have a talk about, well, wait a minute, why? Let's look at this for a moment. How come all of our executives are white males? What can we do? What haven't we been doing? And you start to introduce policies that can result in long-term systemic change. I mean, real substantive change that starts just with that initial conversation. But this isn't something that's just going to be fixed with a Band-Aid overnight by companies issuing, tweets and we support Black Lives Matter slogans. It's not really the solution. That's where the rubber really hits the road, because I think for everyone that sees the video of what happened to George Floyd, it's so easy to say that's wrong. All of us can see that's wrong. I mean, Republicans see it as wrong. The president sees it as wrong. I mean, it's not difficult to come out and say I'm against this. It's not difficult to come out and say I'm against racism either. But I think really implementing change, you're going to obviously be taking some opportunities away from other people. And I think some other people, when they have those opportunities taken away to try and make a better effort at diversity or more Black representation in particular, that's going to ruffle feathers. That this is not going to be an easy process, because to some degree, it is a zero-sum game. I mean, racism or lack of racism, rather, if it was completely, if we were completely colorblind, you would think,
okay, everyone has a fair shot. It's not a zero-sum game. Everybody's out there competing against each other. But the reality is, it is a zero-sum game when you're talking about board positions and when you're talking about executives or a chief operating officer role or a CEO role or something like that. As chief of strategy, there's only so many of these roles at companies. So if you are hiring a Black person or another minority, it does mean someone else is not getting that job. And that's never easy for whoever doesn't get that job. And I think, this is the one area where people who oppose this kind of thing, because it's now I'm venturing towards sort of affirmative action, where they say somebody who is qualified should not be kept out of that job or should not be passed over just so a minority can be represented in the role. And it's interesting. I heard, I think it was last year, I was listening to a podcast, and I don't even remember which one it was, where somebody said, yes, we're going to just have to deal with that. There are going to be some people, individuals, who lose out as we try and adjust this to make it more fair. Hopefully it's temporary. Hopefully we're going to go through some difficult years, and it could be a decade, it could be more than a decade, where we have to go in and tinker to try and make things more fair. And then hopefully it just becomes a much better and a much more level playing field. But the reality is there's going to be some people who lose out as a result of this effort.
Well, and look, I mean, that's just such a hollow argument, and I get really frustrated when I hear that, because it presupposes that white candidate was the better candidate objectively on paper. And what we know, and this is the very essence of systemic entrenched racism, is that a white interviewer interviewing a white candidate is going to relate to that individual in a way that he or she doesn't necessarily relate to a visible minority, and therefore we start to see a blurring of criteria that is quote unquote objective, such as marks or particular academic credentials, and qualities that are subjective. So, I think it's a somewhat hollow argument to simply suggest that, well, we're going to give it to an individual that is not as qualified because they're a visible minority. Again, it's a false premise. It assumes that the white candidate historically has always been the better candidate, and that's why they've gotten the job. And that's just not the case. But the other thing I wanted to talk about, Cam, that's been sort of interesting around the protests is that we're starting to see, and there's one example that's popped up here in Canada over the last week, but we're starting to see a bit of a Me Too phenomenon. If you recall, when the Weinstein story broke, there was just this flood of individuals that were coming forward with their own personal experience of examples of harassment, of sexual harassment, of assault, and naming names. And we're starting to see a similar phenomenon occur in this movement as well. There was one example recently this week with Jessica Mulrooney, who is married to Ben Mulrooney, who of course is the son of former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulrooney, and she has a rather large social media following. She's also quite close friends with Meghan Markle, and she was called out this week by a social media influencer who runs a product line named Sasha Exeter. And apparently, and again, I'm people can check out the details on the story. I'm not entirely familiar with the back and forth, but I did want to raise it as an interesting example. But that Sasha alleges that Jessica Mulrooney threatened her livelihood, and she called her out, and from the position that that Mulrooney was threatening Sasha on the basis that she is a Black woman, and that there was a racialized element to Mulrooney's threat. And as you can imagine, the pushback was fast and furious. Mulrooney was dropped from a CTV program. that she has, and I understand that subsequently there have been other sponsors that have refused to work with her going forward. And I don't think this is going to be an isolated case. I think we're going to start to see a lot more of these examples. And again, I think if that results in some real substantive change, great. I think that's great, much like the Weinstein case, and I hope that it does.
I have to call you out a little bit because I had there are a couple problems I thought with a couple things that you said. So, one, you said that it's a misnomer to say that the black candidate isn't the better candidate; that the black candidate often is the better candidate. I don't think we can say that. I think it's very difficult to say that because we're assuming something, and I think it's probably fair to speculate that in some cases that was the case, and in other cases it wasn't, because we don't have statistics on this, obviously. So I don't think every time a black person has applied for the same job as a white person that they were the better candidate. I'm sure they were sometimes, but I don't want to automatically assume that. But I think the racism is far more systemic than at the hiring level. I mean, this goes way back. I mean, there's fewer black students graduating from high school, fewer that are going into university, fewer that are graduating or getting master's degrees. And so when you get to the senior executive level, there are fewer there to choose from in many cases. So I think racism is an issue, especially at the executive level. But I think it's the sort of end result of all of the racism previous to that level that has impacted the choice that is being made at the end of that train. That they've been held back at so many other points in their lives, and it's that has to be addressed. And this is where I'm saying we may need to, make sure that when there are, and there's very, very many talented black people out there. I'm not suggesting there's not, but I'm saying numbers wise, if you're looking at university graduates and things like that. So we have to make sure that they're given every opportunity. And I think it's okay if from time to time, even if they aren't the best candidate, that they are still given the opportunity. I think obviously they need to be, qualified enough to be in that role. But in order to change this, we have to change the entire cycle. We need to have many more, black people represented in senior roles in sports and in business and, in many on Wall Street, in many other areas. Because once we get that established, hopefully that does trickle down, and the next generation and the generation after that, they start to see, that there is not systems holding them back, which is what is happening today. And I don't know the Mulroney case you talked about. I had not heard about that. But it's the same thing. Like, I'm firmly in the court of Black Lives Matter, and I've done a lot of research, obviously, on Harvey Weinstein and everything with the Me Too movement. But I'm still not at the point where I'm saying believe women. And I think, you and I have both watched Bill Maher, and I think he makes a good point, which is trust women, take women seriously. When they say something, take it seriously, investigate it, because too many times we've just written them off or just ignored it. And I think when anyone makes an accusation, anytime, it should be taken seriously, but it doesn't automatically mean that accusation is true. And I think we need to draw a line there a little bit. I'm not suggesting it's not true, but I'm suggesting there should be an investigation and it should be taken seriously.
Well, yeah, I think absolutes with regard to virtually any argument is incredibly, incredibly dangerous. But, I wanted to go back. I'm not, I wasn't saying that I think that the visible minority candidate is always going to be better qualified than the white candidate. The only point I'm trying to make is that the very nature of discrimination, systemic discrimination, adverse discrimination in these contexts is that we rely on our own experience, on our own histories in the way that we approach any situation, including a job interview. And therefore, you're going to rely on those experiences in your perception, my perception of the world as a white male, and that's going to inform the way that I approach any interview and any interview candidate. And what I'm saying is that to come away and conclude that, the white candidate was objectively the better candidate may not necessarily be the case. We may be able to swap me out, replace me with one of my colleagues who may happen to be a woman or may happen to be a visible minority, and she can come to the complete opposite conclusion. Point being that there's a blurring of what is objectively the best candidate and what might actually be subjectively the best candidate, and that adverse discrimination informs these decisions. It informs the way that we come and reach these particular conclusions. And those are the issues that are very, very, very difficult to fix.
And we have to be very aware of them. I mean, I think you and I have both over the years hired many people. I mean, I've interviewed so many people. I don't even remember the number. It's so many. And yes, they're obviously, it's very hard to remove your own biases from an interview, because like naturally I do like someone who is outgoing and cheerful and well-spoken and, you know, all of these things that I go, yes, I connect with you. I like you. This is good. And then I think, you know, there are people who are not that way, who could be better at the job, you know, depending on what that job is. And I do need to remove my own bias a little bit on sort of personality type, background. I don't think I've ever sort of discriminated on background, but personality type and things like that. And be more aware of the way I'm reading a situation, and that I'm reading it from my own, I hate to use the word privilege, but like I'm reading it from my own perch. And sometimes my perch isn't the best way to look at a situation. But I do want to say, because we'll have to move along here, but for companies, I did want to say, if I was advising companies, especially on the communication side of it, number one, obviously, a statement would have to go out. I think a lot of companies have done that. Those that haven't done it are under pressure to do it. But I think the statement does have to have some sort of substance. I think there would have to be some sort of group set up in the workplace, or some sort of committee to take a look at the issue, to take a look at hiring, to take a look at the executive team, to look at HR and how it's structured. I think that there would have to be the announcement combined with some evidence of real work about to be done or already started to be done in that announcement for it to have any effect. And I do think in a year or 2 or 3, if something happens again like this, people are going to be far less forgiving of companies. I think even today they're not very forgiving of companies. But since this has happened, and with the huge change in support for the Black Lives Matter movement, I think it's pretty critical that action happen, or companies are going to find themselves in the crosshairs. Ewan, I know you've probably got more on this too. I think we got to keep moving along because we're up against the clock a bit. So we'll head into our next section right on the other side.
Show your support to the PR and Law podcast by making a one-time donation or setting up a subscription with us on Patreon. Every little bit helps us keep the lights on and bring the show to you each week. If you'd like to chip in, please visit prandlawpodcast.com. That's prandlawpodcast.com. Click support the show. Thanks for helping us out.
There is so much to talk about this week. I have more notes here to go over. I can't even get to. But anyway, Ewan, what's up? What's up on your side?
Well, yeah, sort of the same thing over here. I mean, what I wanted to talk about really could take up an entire episode, at least from a legal perspective. But we don't really have much time. But I do want to sort of address it, because it was a story that didn't get a great deal of coverage this week, and I think it's really, really important. And that was on Thursday, President Trump signed an executive order sanctioning members of the International Criminal Court. They're currently investigating U.S. troops and intelligence officials for possible war crimes during the war in Afghanistan. I was somewhat surprised how little coverage this got in North American press.
I had not heard this either. First time.
Yeah. Well, it's a big deal, and I'm not surprised that it was. I wouldn't be surprised if it was deliberately trying to fly under the radar. But I wanted to talk about it a little bit in terms of the order. So this order would apply to any court staff that's involved in the investigation, and includes any of their family members. So the order would prevent these individuals from being able to visit the U.S., as well as prevent them from accessing any assets they may hold in U.S. financial institutions. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, he briefly addressed this issue with the press on Thursday. He referred to the ICC as a kangaroo court, quote unquote. And he went on to say that, and this was the direct quote that I found in a tweet that led me to, I think, one article sort of addressing it. I saw very, very few. But he said, "We cannot allow ICC officials and their families to come to the United States to shop and travel and otherwise enjoy American freedoms as these same officials seek to prosecute the defender of those very freedoms." Look, and we don't have time to go into a history of the International Criminal Court, but I wanted to touch on it briefly because, first of all, this isn't the first time that the U.S. has taken aim at the International Criminal Court. So last year, Mike Pompeo, for example, he actually revoked the visa of the ICC's chief prosecutor after she asked the ICC to open an investigation into alleged war crimes in Afghanistan. And this also, it's not even a partisan issue, Cam. So the history of the ICC, it was established in 2002 pursuant to a treaty known as the Rome Statute, and it was created for a very, very specific purpose, and that's prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide around the world. You'd think that that's an issue that all governments would want to rally behind and support. Now, a number of countries were signatories to the initial treaty, and I want to talk about the distinction between being a signatory and then ultimately ratifying the treaty. So this was under Bill Clinton's administration, and Bill Clinton, in fact, waited until the last possible day to sign on to the treaty and become a member, but he never ratified the treaty. So there's 123 countries around the world, Cam, that have ratified this. Then there are 4 that are signatories that haven't ratified, the United States being one, and then the other 3 are Israel, the Sudan, and Russia. So George Bush comes to office. George Bush doesn't ratify it. And sorry, that's George W. Bush. Obama becomes president. He doesn't ratify it. So again, this is not a partisan issue. It's not like let's beat up on Republicans or let's beat up on Democrats. Both sides have had opportunities to ratify this treaty, and they've failed and refused to do so, which of course begs the obvious question, well, why? Well, why wouldn't the United States want to ratify it? Well, the answer to that is really, really simple. If the United States were to ratify the treaty, the ICC would have the ability to prosecute Americans operating around the world, notably military, soldiers, government officials, and they are very, very, very reluctant to let that happen.
Yeah, I understand why they would be reluctant. I am not as familiar with this case. I know a little bit about the court. I mean, in general, like when you say it's bipartisan, I get that. It's sort of like with the U.S. complaining to NATO in terms of Germany and France paying their fair share of what they're supposed to for their national defense. That is something that's been going on from president to president to president, and Trump carried on the tradition. But it's handled differently when Trump does something, I feel like, in the media. But he's sort of been consistent with his predecessors on that issue. Ewan, I might not be as friendly of an ear to this topic. I don't know it well enough, so I'm really reluctant to speak, other than I know that in other instances, there's usually some level of justified apprehension about something. Like, I do feel like the World Health Organization, for instance, has badly discredited itself with the information that it put out, with its ties with China. And when the U.S. decided to, or when Trump announced that he would pull out of the WHO, I did not have a huge problem with that, because I no longer trust the WHO myself based on its own behavior, especially in light of COVID-19. Now, I feel like if it were a different president, it would be probably an issue where people fell on either side of it. But I feel like because it was Donald Trump who did it, then it must be an awfully horrible thing that he did. And that's sort of where we are with anything that Trump does. I'm trying to avoid falling into that. I disagree with the vast majority of what the president does, but on something like this, I get it. On NATO, I get it as well. The U.S. is paying its basically covering the costs of some very developed and wealthy countries, which doesn't particularly make much sense. And then on an issue like this, I mean, I would have to go into it a bit more, but I can see why a country could hold two positions at the same time, being in favor of prosecuting people who, were accused of war crimes, while at the same time not wanting to turn over sovereignty of this issue to an international organization, because there's just so much evidence already that international organizations aren't always as they seem to be. I think the Human Rights Tribunal is such a good example of that. When you have Saudi Arabia and China and whatnot heading up human rights organizations, there's a problem. So I share the overall skepticism of some of these international organizations while not being entirely clear on this particular one. So I reserve the right to change my mind if I get more background on this one. But I mean, what does this mean then, Ewan, for the U.S. going forward? Because it's not going to ratify this, and what's the fallout of that? Not just for the U.S. but for other signatories and countries that ratified it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's sort of two separate issues, right? I mean, the ratification is one issue, and look, sure. I mean, are there political arguments on both sides of that? Sure. I mean, obviously, it's an issue that Democrats and Republicans are united on in some regard, because both parties have had administrations in the White House and have neglected to ratify the treaty. But I mean, this is sort of a further step. I mean, to suggest that you're going to penalize any individual who is working or involved in the investigation of war crimes in the war in Afghanistan, and that you're going to prevent those individuals from coming to the United States and their families from coming to the United States or accessing their assets. I mean, that's kind of next level. And the concern, of course, is that it will have a chilling effect. I mean, the reality is that whether or not there were war crimes committed in Afghanistan, these investigations are important. They're important for the future of war crimes and any genocide that may be committed in other regions around the world. So it's important that these investigations are able to operate with some level of judicial independence, carry out those investigations, and reach whatever conclusions they reach. I mean, really, that should be in everybody's benefit. So to take such a strong stance to say that, yeah, okay, fine, we're not ratifying it, we don't recognize your investigation, but not only that, if you are working in this investigation, you're banned effectively, as are your family members. I don't know of, I'm not familiar with any other government taking such a position as this, and to do so by way of executive order is it's scary. I think it's pretty scary.
I do think sometimes people forget. Like I do feel, geez, I don't want this show to become partisan. I do feel like sometimes on the left there is a lot of bowing to what is right or what the consensus is, and you can see this even with COVID-19 in the US. It looks like Democrats are far more responsible about putting masks on, whereas Republicans are they don't want to be told what to do. And I think in a case like this, and probably many other cases, I don't think the US is joining these organizations for the PR of it. I think they're thinking very clearly in their own interest. And I don't begrudge them that, because you're right about the fallout. It's chilling, but they intend to make it chilling because they know, and we've seen pictures from Afghanistan. There was very questionable behavior going on there. So of course the United States doesn't want there to be any serious inquiries into this, and they want to scare people off it because it's not in the US's interest. So they have behaved completely logically if you're looking at it from that perspective, because I don't think the US is too concerned about what other countries think, especially right now under this president, but just in general. I think the US is has a history of operating that way, and it's going to take the steps that are in its own interest. And I think this is just a very clear example of that. And I think if the rest of us in Canada or over here in Hong Kong or elsewhere, if we hold the US up as the country that will do the right thing, I think we're going to be disappointed more often than not. I have a great deal of respect for the United States, but I think it has always basically operated in this way.
Well, yeah, but I mean, again, my concern is simply that it's one thing to say, A, we're not going to participate, B, we're not going to recognize or acknowledge what you're doing. It's something else entirely to say we're going to go the extra step to punish any of those individuals who are actively involved and do recognize and do participate. And it's that third step that is problematic for me.
And that is, I think, the Trump administration. So while the U.S. has operated in its own interest before, I do feel like it is more aggressive now. It's more open now. It's less concerned about the optics of its decisions than it's ever been. And maybe that's why that third step was taken this time, because it is extreme. But I mean, we're looking at now the U.S. putting sanctions on, Hong Kong government officials. I mean, these are people who oftentimes grew up in the West and were educated in the West, and they're as American as any Asian person could be, but there's sanctions coming there too. A very interesting topic, Ewan. And it isn't going to be interesting to see what happens as a result of that. There's a ton of stuff I have on the recommended list here, and you mentioned a column earlier. Do you have anything else that you would like to share?
Well, I'll let you go ahead, because I think I spent a lot of time talking about Marianne's article, which, again, I really think people should read, because it just dispels a lot of the myths, a lot of the noise around the Black Lives Matter movement, around the protests, around adverse and systemic discrimination in the police force. And among citizens in general. So I think that's my piece. I'll leave it at that, and I'll pass it to you in terms of what you have to recommend.
All right. Well, this is why I wish this show was like 2 hours long, because any of these things could have been legitimate sections of the show that we could go into at some depth. So the first is, I think people are aware, or maybe not, that the New York Times was embroiled in a bit of a controversy this week after it published an op-ed from Tom Cotton, who is a senator, and it argued for deploying the U.S. military to basically clean up the streets of protesters. And there was outrage at the fact that was published. There is a sort of war, a civil war happening within journalism ranks that's gotten more intense over the last few years, and it boiled over on this case, and it led to the editorial page editor resigning and leaving the newspaper. The New York Times has published its take on what happened, why this was published, where the flaws were, why it shouldn't have been published. And then some columnists have chimed in as well. So there's actually several articles on this subject. If you're interested in journalism or information and how it is being created and distributed in this day of wokeness, you want to take in some of these. And I think one of the best ones is from one of my favorite writers out there, and has been for a long time. It's Roger Cohen, and he's got one called The Outcry Over Both Sides Journalism: Moral Clarity or Only One Acceptable Truth. So I think that's good. Second one, and I stumbled into this. I had been reading something on gender dysphoria and about the transformation happening for transgender people, when JK Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter novels, was mentioned. And I guess she has been kind of quietly signaling support or rather opposition to the trans community on some certain levels, which I wasn't aware of. And then just a couple of days ago, like 3 days ago, she published a very long blog post on her website, which says are her reasons for speaking out on sex and gender issues. Again, very interesting read, very, very intimate. She opens up a lot about her own background and some of the awful situations she's found herself in over time. And even if you disagree with her findings, I do disagree with some of the things that she said. I do think that it's honest and she is being open, and I respect that a lot. I think it's a really interesting article. The other one I wanted to mention, Marc Maron has a podcast. He's probably one of the most successful podcasters out there. After you talk about Joe Rogan, who's gone to Spotify, Marc Maron's been a comedian. He loves comedians. If you've ever listened to his show, he interviews comedians. He's had more than 900 shows. He's interviewed everyone except Jerry Seinfeld. And there are some websites dedicated to this, in fact, that Marc Maron just doesn't get Jerry Seinfeld's humor. He thinks he's too perfect. And Seinfeld feels like Marc Maron is just pretentious. And so they don't have a lot of respect for each other. At least that was the rumor. But Jerry Seinfeld finally went on Marc Maron's podcast called WTF. And it was at times a difficult listen, because you can hear that there is they are tense with each other. And here's one clip from the show that I wanted to play. This is when Seinfeld was saying, if you're funny, you're funny. That's really all there is to it. There's nothing deeper than that. When Marc Maron kind of makes the case that you have to have some sort of trauma in your life, or some anger or rage or hurt that makes you a better comic. But here's a clip from the show.
You're funny if you're funny.
Yeah.
And you love to be funny. If you're funny and you love to be funny,
yeah,
there you go.
So, okay. But so you never question the psychology of funny.
No, I reject that entire premise.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Look at my face.
Yeah.
You see that I totally reject that? You're funny if you're funny, period.
But so there's no why.
No. If there is, who cares?
That was one clip, and I have to tell you, there is another instance where it gets a little emotional, and towards the end where it's a little confrontational. And they're two extremely different people, and they both love comedy, yet they both approach it from a completely different perspective. And it's interesting to hear them have a discussion. It's one thing I love about that podcast. It's very, 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 very real.
Oh, I'm definitely going to check that out. I like Maron. I listen to his podcast often. I think it's interesting that anybody would refer to him as pretentious. I mean, Marc Maron might be a lot of things, whether he's your cup of tea or not. I don't know that I would refer to him as pretentious. I think part of his charm is the complete opposite. He has a real uncanny ability to come across as sort of an everyman and relate to all individuals that are on his show. But I didn't know about the history with Jerry Seinfeld. I'm definitely gonna check that one out.
While we mentioned that, there's one other show that was similar to this, but I think more emotional, was an interview with Louis C.K. Right,
Louis C.K. Yeah.
Yeah, so Louis C.K. and Maron, I guess, had been friends like over a decade or maybe two ago, and had a falling out and lost touch, but then reconnected for the podcast. And that was another difficult one to listen to because you could hear raw emotion on both sides. They were close. They're not now. I think they reconciled to some degree. So anyway, it is a good podcast. I do endorse it just in general. Anything else, Ewan, you want to add before we wrap up the show?
One quick point, because you talked about JK Rowling, and there was a story that followed one of the US, or sorry, excuse me, not the US papers, one of the British papers, and I'm not sure which one it was, interviewed her first husband. And in that blog post that you talked about that she posted, she speaks, as I understand it, I haven't read it, but quite candidly about the abuse that she suffered at the hands of her first husband. This particular paper interviewed the husband, who was very, very clear that he is not in any way remorseful for the abuse that he subjected her to. And there was a lot of pushback following the publication of that article. A lot of people and a lot of people supportive of the Me Too movement commented that this is yet another way of setting back the movement, because once again, we're effectively giving a voice to the abuser and compromising or potentially silencing the very women who want to come out and talk about these issues, because we're continuing to give a voice to the abuser, and that this is why women are reluctant to come forward, because inevitably their accusers are given a platform that they don't often deserve. So anyway, interesting. I saw a lot of really interesting stories in response to the publication of that article.
Wow, that is too bad, because she says in the article, that there are things to this day that really sort of not give her flashbacks, but startle her to a deep emotional level, like a loud sound or a door slamming or something. And so, yeah, I imagine it's very difficult if she ends up seeing him being interviewed and his comments being shared everywhere. It wouldn't be easy. Anyway, so I do recommend checking that out. So that's it. We had an absolutely packed show this week. There was so much to go over. There's actually stuff that I've left on the cutting room floor here. I guess we'll have to save it for next week. As always, please, if you've got any questions for us, please tag us on social media. It's PR Law Pod, PRLAWPOD. Tell a friend if you love the show, and follow us on social media. We would love to see you on there. We post on there fairly regularly, I think, at least every time a new show comes out. So we're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and the account is PR Law Podcast. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ewan. Good times.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun, Cam.
All right, we'll see you guys next week.
This has been the PR and Law Podcast with Cam McMurchie and Ewan Christie. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or leave a review. You can also join us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by following our account at PR Law Podcast. That's all one word, PRLAW Podcast. Thanks for your support.